Yeah, so good evening to you all. Thanks for logging on tonight. Quick intro for myself. I've been teaching Latin 13, 14 years now. And wow, I got into teaching just because I love Latin so much. I didn't want to let it go. I didn't want it to fade into just something that maybe I did in college or an academic interest on the side while I pursued other things. So teaching allowed me to do that, and God has been very good in that. I've taught at many K through 12s. I've taught in a charter school scene. I've taught at a boarding school. I've taught at a minor seminary, at an abbey. And I'm here now at the Collegium and pleased to be here. This is my first year teaching here, and I'm really excited about it because the Collegium takes its Latin program seriously, which can't be said about all institutions. And so I'm pleased to be on the team and help promote that. So I want to talk about, in ascending order, if you will, some of the value, the benefit that we derive from a serious and committed study of the Latin language. I'm going to start with what you might call a practical value. And I don't want to put too much time into this for two reasons. One, because when we talk about a liberal arts education, we're not approaching education and one's time in college from a utilitarian perspective, right? Obviously, you should gain benefits from what you do and be able to apply it in the world. That's highly important, but that's not the kernel of what we're doing. We're talking about formation of the person. So I don't want to spend a whole lot of time on practical value, but also just because I think this is more applicable to perhaps pursuing some Latin studies in the K through 12 setting, which I know not every student gets that comes into here. It's certainly not required, but on the other hand, it is a growing phenomenon. And how do we build upon that? So we'll spend a little bit of time on the practical value. Then we're going to move on to what I would call the analytical value or the logical value. What is the formative effect of studying Latin, how that benefits a student who's in a liberal arts education. And again, in ascending order, we'll move on to more important matters, namely the spiritual value of studying Latin. And from there, we'll branch out into discussions of pedagogical approach as we have here at the Collegium, because it is unique as far as the way we approach it compared to many other institutions. And we'll just round out with Latin as a note of our identity as Roman Catholics. So to the practical value, and again, this will take up the least amount of our time here, but this is the type of stuff that you might hear, say, if you were going to enroll your child in a homeschool setting with a program maybe online that talks about the value of Latin, or if you were to go to a charter school or private school that has maybe a 2, 3, perhaps even a 4-year Latin program. Some of the things that might be the selling points of Latin that are certainly important, they're relevant, and but they're of the lower value. So you have some of the things like many studies out there linking the study of Latin and higher math scores, right? Math is one of those utilitarian things that's important to everyone as well. It should be. So there's a link there. And our listeners could go and Google that, and you could find all sorts of studies linking those two together. Of course, it helps with your English vocabulary, right? I mean, if you take just one Latin word such as pater, right, father, and it's such a basic vocabulary word in Latin, and yet it gives us what you might call polysyllabic words, right? Words of high speech that mean so many different things that a student has access to simply because they know some basic Latin vocabulary. Patriotism, paternal, patricide, and the list goes on and on and on. So, English is not a Romance language. It's not immediately derived from Latin, but because of the twists and turns of history, a lot of our vocabulary, and again, I would emphasize the polysyllabic words, the words of high speech, are Latin derived. Grammar, with the implosion of education in general in our country and really throughout the world, who gets good grammar study anymore, right? And yet, when you learn your maternal language, you learn it through usage a lot. And there isn't anymore in schools, unfortunately, a committed program to pursuing, well, what are the mechanics of language? Why this and why that? And so a lot of times it gives us a lens to look at our own language and also just the general mechanics of language through studying Latin. There's a popular book out there called I Never Knew English Until I Studied German, right? There's a value in seeing through a foreign language how language works, and then you can apply that to your own language so that we begin to speak properly and distinctly so we can convey important ideas. Again, these are some utilitarian purposes to studying Latin. Additionally, of course, you could talk about it provides the fundamental lexicon for many different fields of study. So, for example, when I was in grad school, a lot of the Latin students would pay and make their way through grad school by tutoring the students who were going into law or to medicine, just because Latin provides, like I said, the lexicon and the nomenclature of those fields. Of course, there's the sciences, philosophy, theology. Like, why is gold on the periodic table of the elements Au? Well, of course, it comes from aurum, right, in Latin. So, and there's many others of that too. So, if we were to give students Latin, and I would argue and propose from an early age, there's going to be a lot of practical benefit in other different facets of their education they would have if they would get some of this stuff in a regular, disciplined way in their K through 12 setting. And of course, those are things that they're going to derive from studying Latin here with us, because it's not required that you have a background in Latin to come here. It's certainly helpful, and I would like to see the phenomenon of Latin study in K through 12 pick up again, and it seems like it certainly is. So enough said, I think, for now of the practical value of studying Latin. Let's move to the analytical value, namely how it helps the mind. Because we're human beings, we're not pure spirit. The way we think is related to word. And so when we begin to speak and when we study language, the inherent traits of a language begin to impress themselves upon the mind. Thought functions through the vehicle of speech itself. And so the traits of a language are going to affect one's thought processes and patterns. This is very true with Latin, and because of the uniqueness of Latin, in particular because of its free syntax, because it's a highly inflected language, which is to say, it's always changing its endings, right? We derive meaning from Latin words and sentences not by where we place those words, but by what termination we're giving to the various nouns, adjectives, and verbs. And what that means is you end up with a very free syntactical pattern about where words can be placed. And if that's so, that produces a scenario where you don't get to rely on sequential meaning, such as we do in most modern languages, but you have to pause, you have to wait, you have to receive all information before you can make a judgment about what a given word or a given statement means. You have to see the relationship of words to the total sum. Okay, well, think about what that means for a habit of mind. The idea that you need to receive all information before you make a judgment, right? We're also in modern culture accustomed to knee-jerk reactions to everything. There's got to be knee-jerk response to everything. But to study Latin in an ongoing, disciplined, rigorous, and formal way is to develop a habit of mind that isn't necessarily there, that isn't impressed upon the mind when you study other modern languages. So again, this adds to the analytical value of Latin, which of course touches upon the liberal arts, because what are we doing in a liberal arts education? We're trying to form habits of mind, form virtue, so that students can go out and be virtuous citizens, found virtuous families, and be worthy participants in the polis, if you will, and in the social structure. So I think I want to read a quote for you. This is taken from Verum Sapientia that speaks to this analytical value of the study of Latin. For those who may not be aware, Verum Sapientia is an apostolic constitution that came out, I want to say, in 1962. This is from John the 23rd, at the latter part of his pontificate. And really, it's a clarion call, the document as a whole, to the study of Latin is in trouble in the church and something urgent needs to be done. And it really was a culminating point for arguably 100 to 150 years of a slow decline in the study of Latin and the import that was placed upon it, and then a very fall off the cliff when you come to the 50s and the 60s. And you have various popes throughout those decades, and like I said, century and a half, commenting and noticing of this. And so Verum Sapientia is a culmination of what are we going to do about this as an ecclesial community. And so this was, like I said, promulgated in 1962. But in this document, he says this: there can be no doubt as to the formative and educational value either of the language of the Romans or of great literature generally. It is a most effective training for the pliant minds of youth. It exercises, matures, and perfects the principal faculties of mind and spirit. It sharpens the wits and gives keenness of judgment. It helps the young mind to grasp things accurately and develop a true sense of values. It is also a means for teaching highly intelligent thought and speech. And again, that link between language and thought is very intimate. There's some good psychological studies on how language affects thought. This, what was just said there in Verum Sapientia, of the formative value of just the act of studying Latin, has a really good, I think, cogent example that Benedict XVI gave us. This was taken from, I'm going to read you another quote here. This was taken from an early autobiography of his, published in a work called Milestones. And this was back when he was Cardinal Ratzinger. And as you probably know, he was compelled to join the Hitler Youth, as all the youth of Germany were at the time. But he never mentally assented to the principles that were very forcefully being imposed upon people. And he likens the reason why he did not give intellectual assent to Nazism because he studied Latin. And that may seem like a bit of a push, but let me read you what he says. This is again Benedict XVI. Latin, as the foundation of one's whole education, was then still taught with old-fashioned rigor and thoroughness, something I have remained grateful for my whole life. Not one of the professors of classical studies who belonged to the old guard had joined the party, that is to say, the Nazi party, despite the considerable pressure exerted on government employees. Soon after I arrived at the gymnasium, the second headmaster was removed from his post because he did not bend to the new masters. In retrospect, it seems to me that an education in Greek and Latin antiquity created a mental attitude that resisted seduction by a totalitarian ideology. So you have a very intelligent person here who lived through this cultural takeover, and he ascribes his freedom from that to the study of Latin. That's an amazing statement. That's why we study Latin. That's why it's part of a liberal arts education, because we're wanting to form students in ideas and let them grapple with them and perceive truth, because their mind is trained to do that. There's no greater tool for that process, for that end goal, than the study of Latin, such as Benedict XVI just noted. More could be said about that, but perhaps a little bit too tangential for our purposes tonight. So I'll leave that there with the analytical value. The traits of the language of Latin impress themselves upon the mind. Order, balance, the virtue of suspense of judgment until you have all information, seeing things in their totality. All right, let's talk a little bit about the spiritual value of studying Latin. This certainly the highest reason for doing so as Roman Catholics. And so maybe a little bit obvious, but let's make explicit what it is that we're talking about here. When we give students Latin, and not just a smattering of it so that they can pass through it and say, yeah, I took Latin, 2 years of Latin, I don't remember anything. But really give it its due place, its honorable due place, such as it has always had in the Western patrimony. We're putting them in touch with what we do as Catholics, namely the Mass and the office. At the Collegium, we celebrate the Mass according to the traditional rite, which of course you know the language of that is inherently Latin. It is the Roman rite after all. Much could be said on that. Perhaps I'll touch upon that more later. But we also customarily pray the office in Latin. And so the students begin to have this dialogue of prayer, if you will, with the church and within the church in a more intimate way than simply via a modern language. We're putting them in touch with something, the ethos and the history of prayer that makes up what we do as Catholics. So obviously there's a great spiritual value into making one's own the language of the church, right? Church is a society and we belong to it as members, and a mark of that is Latin is the language of the church. Now I know practically speaking, that's often not seen today. But part of what we're doing here is the restoration of culture, and that's not going to happen unless there's a restoration of the life of the church. That's not going to happen, and that this is a multifaceted problem, but certainly central to that is recapturing the Latinity of who we are as Roman Catholics. I'll talk about that more in a little bit. But in addition to that, we're also putting them in touch with the whole of the Catholic and Western patrimony. I mean, what is the language of the liberal arts? It's Latin. It always has been. Um, and when you give students that opportunity to learn the language, not just passive exposure to it, but to really be formed by it, you're putting them in dialogue with those authors. They are able to join the conversation, as it were. And I would give you this analogy. Consider a child who sits on his father's lap, surrounded by adults speaking about some topic that is certainly above the child's head. And the child is getting something out of it, to be sure, but isn't an intimate partaker in what's going on. That's like receiving the Western patrimony, going through a liberal arts formation in translation. But when you give them Latin, they begin to partake in the conversation. They begin to partake with those who came before them and with those who will come after, in a language that can, like no other, touch the past, influence the present, and touch the future. Okay, we're all familiar with the degradation of modern languages. I often tell my students that I don't know that the English I speak today will be understood by my great-grandchildren. And even in my own, relatively short 40 years, I have seen so many different changes go through in the time that I've been teaching of what means what in English. Modern languages, particularly in the age of media, are so inherently prone to evolution or devolution, you might want to say. But Latin has a value that reaches beyond that. Let's talk then about Latin as, again, the vehicle of the liberal arts. All of this formation, this education that we're giving them, the sine qua non of it is Latin. When we talk about who these authors are, this was all done in Latin. They thought in Latin. I want you to stop and consider just the amazing phenomenon of language that really we all take for granted. But consider that I have a conception in my mind, and that I can give you and put you in touch with my thought processes, and that we do this through language. Now, I speak, you perceive, and now my conception becomes a part of your conception. That's the amazing gift of language. Consider how I could enter a room and write a message down on a paper and leave that room, and you could come in, and I haven't even been there for an hour or days or maybe a year, and you could receive that thought process and it become a part of your own thought process. Again, the gift of language. But that's what education is. It's this ongoing conversation, dialogue with the great minds of the past and, God willing, in the future. What language allows those thoughts and the processes behind them to be received by us? It's not English. It's not Italian. It's not Spanish. It's not even Greek, as important as Greek is. It's Latin. There's characteristics to Latin that are possessed by no other language. So basically, the linguistic and cogitative medium of the whole edifice of Western education is done in Latin. It is what you might say the golden thread of the whole edifice. It touches upon every subject. I mean, there were times, let's say, when Britain ruled the world. What was a British education at the time of a British schoolboy? Half their day was spent in Latin. The other half was Greek and mathematics. Well, why is that? Because if you could do Latin, you could do any of the other subjects, because you had access to the other subjects because of your Latin studies. You can study art, you can study music, you can study philosophy, you can study theology just simply by doing Latin. It's the golden thread of an education. It's the central focus of it that touches every other discipline in ways that periphery disciplines do not. I want to move on just briefly here to talk about pedagogy. And I'm only going to touch this tangentially just because this could become its own topic. Pedagogy, that is to say, the art by which we teach things. Much could be said here. What's the approach that we're taking here at the Collegium. There's a lot of pedagogical infighting among Latinists. In short, there's a grammar translation approach, there's a reading approach, and there's the so-called natural method. And there's some benefit to all of them. Unfortunately, a lot of times there's holdouts of one versus the other. Often when you get a grammar translation approach, you can get some very very well-trained Latinists, but what they really end up being often is decoders. Latin makes sense after I've put it into my mother tongue. And so it's not a living thought process for them. And ultimately, what does that do? It distracts from the dialogue that you need to have with authors that came before us, because you're not conceiving of thoughts with that author. You're decoding those thoughts and then filtering it through your own mother tongue. And certainly there's value in that. But you can have a more intimate reach, say, to the mind of St. Augustine and St. Jerome, if you have been trained to think and to speak and to understand in an active way the language that they themselves used in an active way. It now makes sense to you in ways that, and you can perceive nuances of language. Why might he have said it this way? In ways that is simply not there in translation, which is really what the grammar translation approach is. Now, that said, there's great value to that, but it has some inherent weaknesses. On the other hand, you have the natural method, which basically proposes that we can learn a foreign language as we have learned our mother language. And certainly that's true. Now, it's largely dependent upon the amount of contact hours that you can give it, which no amount of emphasis of a foreign language, even here at the Collegium, can match the amount of language exposure you get from your parents in your natural setting as you grow up and as you receive your mother tongue. So you can't simply match that. But a lot of times what you get there is people who are very fluid and can speak, but the fine details of the language tend to often fall through the cracks. The approach that we often take here at the Collegium is to combine the both. After all, what is language? But it is a phenomenon of reading and writing. And before that, anterior to that, it's a phenomenon of speech and oral comprehension. Why not combine all of them? So that's kind of the approach that we take here, is to take the best of both worlds and put it into one approach that we give the students. So we do go over grammar and the mechanics of language. I do speak frequently, almost exclusively sometimes, in Latin. So the students are hearing this, and over time they begin to be able to respond with it themselves. And it's not just a matter of in with Latin, out with English, but it stays in Latin in the mind. Let's move on to talking about language as identity. I think that we've lost a sense of, well, everyone knows we're in a cultural crisis in so many different regards. But as Roman Catholics, this has struck us particularly hard. And I want to give you some comparison. What does it mean to say that one is German, maybe even living in Germany, and yet not know the German language? It's somewhat of an absurd proposition. What does it mean to say that one is American but doesn't know English? Again, there's something deficient there. It would say that the whole picture is not there. You can't dialogue with the society around you, and you can't touch the history of a given culture, right? We as Catholics need to begin to see that with Latin. That's what we're trying to give them here at the Collegium. We're giving them a solid foundational mark of their identity by exposing them in a really committed, like I said, 4-year program of Latin study. This is part of who we are as Roman Catholics. To be a Roman Catholic and to have no Latin is as absurd as it is to say I'm German living in Germany, but I speak no German. And I think we can see that when we make those comparisons, but we need to see that like we used to as Roman Catholics. We are Latin Rite Catholics. It's a mark of our identity. Language and culture are intimately connected. This is why when the Soviets went into Poland, they tried to destroy Polish culture. They destroyed They tried to destroy Polish academia. They tried to isolate Polish language. They weren't able to do it. This is why the English for 800 years have tried to isolate and ultimately destroy Gaelic. They weren't able to do it. They got really close, but they weren't able to do it because language is so much of who we are as human beings, um, as just any given society, any given nation. But the church is a society above secular societies, right? It's a sacred society. And Latin is the language of that sacred society. And if you don't have that language, baptized though you may be, there's something deficient about that association. We're trying to give students that rightful link to that church society, to that ecclesial reality of what it means to be Roman Catholic. And I'm really pleased to have that opportunity to do that at the Collegium. In addition to Latin being the language, if you will, the res publica Christiana, or what we might call Christendom, it's also historically the language of the res publica literarum, or the language of thought, the language of the academy. A good historical example of that is the group of, say, Lord Mountjoy or St. Thomas More or Erasmus. They're from various backgrounds, but they saw themselves as cives, as citizens of a common intellectual pursuit. And they were able to do that because they had the medium of Latin. Again, it's the mark of a society that was pan-European and really pan-global. Okay, there's wonderful examples of Latinity in Latin and South America, and even in our own country. It wasn't too long ago that even in our own universities, you couldn't hope to get in if you didn't have a solid grounding in Latin and Greek to get into the Ivy schools. It was a presumed part of the process. Again, Latin as a mark of identity is something that we need to spend more time thinking and therefore putting before ourselves as Roman Catholics in order to rejuvenate Latinity in the church, to gain who we are as Roman Catholics. Speaking again about the church, Pius the 12th in Mystici Corporis, he made the association of the mystical body of Christ is the one holy Catholic, apostolic, and Roman church. All right? Now, think about what that means. He's got those fundamental marks there. One holy Catholic and apostolic, such as we say in the creed, but he adds and he emphasizes Roman. Okay? There's something about the mystical body of Christ, that theological concept, that biblical concept, and his linking of it to it is Roman. That could be quite the tangent, but I would refer our listeners to, if you're interested in that topic, and why is Romanitas so important for the ecclesial structure, I'd refer you to some important works here by some good authors. There's The Once and Future Roman Rite by Dr. Kwasniewski. There's just the recently released The Iron Scepter of the Son of Man by Dr. Phimister. And there's Rome and the Origins of Catholic Christianity by Dr. Taylor Marshall. These are good works to see how important Romanitas, with its language, Latinitas, is for what it means to be Christian. So I'll just refer our readers, our listeners to those books. Would be worth your time. I want to pick up again on what I said about how the Soviets were not able to crush Polish, or the English were not able to crush Irish. And yet we Catholics have had a solid Latin culture for millennia. And all of a sudden, it kind of just fell off. And I would propose to you that that is a striking historical example, such as there's nothing on par with that, where you have a global society such as the church, and all of a sudden it lost its language. Again, there was a bit of a 100-year process that led to that, but like I said earlier, in the 50s and 60s, it kind of just fell right off the map. I've actually seen advertisements, say from Hertz Rental Car from the 1950s, advertising rental cars for priests on pilgrimage to Rome, and they did it in Latin because it saved them, the ink to paper process of putting in all the different languages, because they could assume that priests knew Latin, and then all of a sudden they don't. There's no historical example other than that. It's something preternatural, I would say, that we all of a sudden lose this mark of our identity, this language that identifies us as Roman Catholics. So basically, we're trying to acculturate, if you will, our students to the Latinity that is an inherent part of what it means to be Roman Catholic. This is why we give it such import. This is why we give it 4 years here. It's not just a smattering. It's not just a side item. It's part and parcel of what a liberal arts education is and what it means to be Roman Catholic. We want to give our students the best that we can with that. I want to pick up before getting to some closing thoughts and then taking perhaps some Q&A. Just a little bit more background about Verum Sapientia, because really the Collegium is responding to the explicit call that John the 23rd made in that document. It was near, as I said previously, the end of his pontificate, 1962. And of course, I wasn't there, but having heard it from the mouths of those who were, he called the Roman clergy together there in St. Peter's Basilica. It's first solemn signing of a papal document since Rerum Novarum, I believe, of Leo the 13th. He put the document down on the altar, and he looked at the Roman clergy whom he had convoked there, and he said, "Lest anyone think that someone has given this document to an old man who doesn't know what he's signing. I've called you all here so that you may know that I intend this document with my full papal authority." And then he put the document down and he signed it. Unfortunately, it's often referred to as the stillborn document. I mean, after all, the Gregorian University started teaching their philosophy courses in Italian as opposed to Latin the very next day. So in many quarters it was not received well. But there is certainly a reinvigorated desire to take the clarion call of Verum Sapientia about the value and necessity of Latin for the church and the world, and to reinvigorate that. And I'm really pleased to be able to have the opportunity to do that in a sincere and committed way here at the Collegium. And I'll just kind of close with this. Certain traits that John the 23rd noted, and actually he's referring back to an earlier document of Pius XI in, I want to say, 1922, that identified what are the traits of Latin that make it so unique and why it's so necessary for the church. And what they identified was that it's universal character, it's immutable, and it's non-vernacular. Again, it's universal, it's immutable, and it's non-vernacular. And those are traits that the church as a sacred society claims to herself. And if that's true, then the church needs a language that it also reflects those things. Latin is universal. It reaches back historically, not as far as, say, Greek, but Greek has had a lot more change along the way than Latin has. And it's via Latin that these thoughts, these theological principles have been carved in stone, if you will. So Latin has this universal character to it, in such that, like John the 23rd notes in his document, it pertains to no one given nation so much as it pertains to all. So it has this universal, this Catholic character to it. And we need to conceive of that not just geographically, that as he mentions, it pertains to every given society and favors no one above others, but it also reaches back in history, and it can reach forward to the educated people of the future that we hope to have an ongoing dialogue with. Again, I talked previously about the devolution of our own language, and really of every modern language. The Latin is immune to that for various reasons that, again, would be too tangential to go into right now. So it has that universal character to it. It's immutable. The meaning of Latin has already been crystallized, if you will. Transubstantia already means what it means, and it's not going to change. And in part because it's not the language of the streets, right? It's not going to be affected by our common and daily use. Or as I say, Latin should be every Catholic's second language, but never their first, because that preserves that immutability of the language. Well, if the church has immutable truths to teach the world, it needs an immutable language to effectively communicate those truths, not just in the here and now, but throughout time. And lastly, it's non-secular. Again, I mentioned that the church is, of course, a sacred society. It's above just any given secular society. It's sacred. Imagine the value of being able to pray in a language that you've never cursed in yourself, or that you have never heard curse words. There's a sacredness to Latin that the modern languages simply can't touch. So again, it's non-secular value. It's something elevated above just the common speech. So these are the traits that John the 23rd identified. And again, what a wonderful gift we can give to our students. And I'm very pleased, very proud to be able to do that here at the Collegium. In just closing, I just want to reemphasize that Latin is simply who we are as an authentic culture. It's who we are as an ecclesial reality, and we owe that to our students and really to ourselves to pursue that and to re-Latinize ourselves as Roman Catholics.